Do 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 do. Extras.
Standing at the entrance to the mountain's tunnel and cave complex, Balvan is an 8-foot force of nature. Mount Pillar looms over the plains of the Shadowfell for many, many miles, appearing to rise high above the ceiling of the plain because it is visible from such a distance. It was named by early residents of the surface who believed it to be holding up the sky, and Balvan is the spirit of that mountain. In a real, if hard to explain sense, he is the mountain, and the mountain is him. Although he's a fairly obscure figure, even to lore masters, Balvan does have a bit of a special place in history for at least one thing. Long, long ago, a warrior met him and observed the millstone in combat, and that warrior spent years studying Balvan's technique. A mortal cannot attain that kind of connection to the earth and stone, certainly not in the same way. He is the mountain. But there are other aspects to his fighting, his footwork, his chi power, which this warrior learned to emulate in some small way. This ancient warrior went on to instruct others in a new discipline, a new way of battle, inspired by the mountain. And that was the birth of what later became known as the Stone Dragon style, the same martial discipline that includes attacks like Mountain Hammer, Crushing Vice of the Mountain, and of course, Mountain Tombstone Strike. Balvan isn't a warblade. He isn't even necessarily thrilled or flattered to have inspired mortals to use abilities based upon his own. But he was the inspiration, and that may have been part of what Little One sensed in his chi when passing close by him. I can't go into Balvan's backstory yet, not really, because of spoilers, but if you want to know why the Raj's fate matrix suggested that the party could not defeat him, let's take a look at his stat block, just for fun. Important note, you have to remember that they would not know most of this information when fighting him, and therefore, due to the exploratory process happening while he was pounding them, they would have a much harder time assessing how they could defeat him compared to you or I just reading his abilities and comparing them to the party's capabilities. Plus, the simple fact that they were told they could not defeat him might have been to some degree self-fulfilling. If they suffered a ton of damage up front, with no sign of bloodying the Guardian in return, that prediction would drastically increase the chances of them giving up and running. Strength 46. If you're not so familiar with 3rd Ed or 3.5 D&D, 24 is pretty high strength for a player character, including magic. It's not uncommon for big and or powerful monsters to have strength in the mid to high 20s, and strength in the 40s isn't unheard of, but you do not usually see a number like 46 for anything that isn't a colossal creature, or a top-end ultimate demon or angel or something. Balvan also has the fairly extreme and obviously intentional round number of 500 hit points. You don't normally see numbers like that in the monster manuals, especially the first or second one. But as a GM, you have to make an assessment. The challenge rating system can be good for guidelines, but if your party is particularly strong, especially in terms of their damage output, you can easily reach a bad point where appropriate CR fights get crushed way too quickly and easily. But if you raise the CR of the opponents any further, you can easily cross over into monsters that half the party can't reliably damage, or you find that monsters who are tough enough to go a few rounds with the party are so deadly that the party can't go a few rounds with them. So if the main issue is that the party just deals too much damage for their level, a straightforward, if fairly unsatisfying way to handle it is to artificially inflate the hit points of the opponents. Now, I try hard to limit this to special creatures, things which, in lore, should be especially powerful and difficult to defeat. If the party stomps some regular encounters, that's ultimately not a big deal. But I don't want colossal dragons or Deathfin monitors to be pushovers, so very select enemies in the don't mess with this category may have radically inflated hit points, making it very hard for the party to defeat them without careful preparation and maybe a few more levels. So Balvan has massive strength and hit points. Thanks to that strength, his attacks are pretty good. His first attack at plus 29 to hit should very reliably hit the party tanks. The second attack should also usually hit, though a little less if Little One's using his shield and they have Draven's deflection buff. And against the lower AC party members, that third attack should hit more than half the time. Also, you really don't want to get hit 3 times, because he punches for as much as 3d6 plus 27. And he's so boss that his attacks just naturally ignore damage reduction. He would probably be using the shield, the slab, aka the gravestone, which means he's only punching one-handed, so 1 times strength instead of 1.5 times, but even then, he's hitting reliably for almost 30 damage. It is notable that his dexterity is terribad, and the party could easily have figured this out. In the what-if combat I show in the post-credits scene, I assumed Little One would throw him off the cliff. It would be nearly impossible for him to do so via brute force, as it turns out. But they would have known that Balvan wanted the Ring of Sloth, and they knew that ring's powers only work for creatures with 8 or less dexterity. The throw maneuvers let you choose whether to use strength or dexterity, and forces the enemy to use the same thing. So knowing that he had bad dex, Little One almost certainly would have chosen that, and easily won the opposed roll. But what stops them from just killing him, just burning him down with damage? Well, his armor class is solid, but honestly, everyone but Draven would hit 28 pretty reliably with their weapon attacks, and with that dex of 6, his touch AC is garbage against Draven's wands. With his shield, he has AC 32, which is obviously better, but the party was killing things with 30 plus armor class like 5 levels ago. More significant, given how much of the party's damage is physical, is that he has ludicrous damage reduction. He resists 19 damage per hit from any physical source, rising to 24 with his shield. You can bypass his DR with Mountain Hammer or similar maneuvers, but even then, he weirdly ignores the bonus damage from those maneuvers, because they're all ultimately based on him. Looking into his resistances, most spells won't get you far either. He takes half damage from elemental sources, kind of like attacking an inanimate object, except unlike inanimate objects, he also takes half from Sonic. He's immune to acid and has 5 resistance against fire, cold, and electricity, which applies after the damage is halved. So with 500 HP, he just eats fireballs. Between the DR and physical resistances, he's also effectively immune to anything Angel could do in hand-to-hand, although she could switch to her force crossbow, which would still cause damage. He also has 2 points of force resistance, effectively, making him even more annoying to Angel, and very hard to magic missile, though that wouldn't actually affect Draven's force orbs very much. But his reflex save is awful, and his will is not too high, so you could trip him up with crowd control effects. We then list the special ability which makes him immune to all falling damage and any damage caused by earth or stone. And for coolness purposes, he can conserve 100% of any momentum he has when colliding with stone and use it to bounce back. Because technically, even with strength 46, jumping back up the cliff would be a little dubious by standard rules. The primal stone ability is what makes him immune to the bonus damage from stone dragon maneuvers, so Mountain Hammer would ignore his DR, but not deal plus 2d6 damage to him. However, we also see that his godlike strength is halved to a decidedly mortal-like 23 if he's ever more than 10 feet from his mountain. He can stone shape at will, which could let him do sneaky things to counter some kinds of tactics the party could use to hose him. But here's the fun part. The OG ability that inspired the entire Stone Dragon discipline. Balvan's Avalanche ability is a full round action which he would normally use in place of his full attack. He starts with a regular Mountain Hammer attack, so his normal damage plus 2d6. He ignores damage reduction, but he does that anyway. If this attack hits, he gets a follow-up with another attack at -5 to hit against the same target, but this time it deals plus 6d6 damage, like the level 6 maneuver Elder Mountain Hammer. And if that hits, he can try for a third hit at -10. The third hit deals plus 12d6 damage, like the level 9 maneuver Ancient Mountain Hammer, which means that if he is able to hit all 3 attacks, he would jackhammer the target for 9d6 plus 81 and another 20d6 damage, or 27 less damage if one hand is occupied by his shield. That averages 180 or 150 damage. Now, often he would miss the 3rd or 2nd attack, drastically reducing the beatdown. But if he ever got that off, that would be a pretty good run away moment, possibly carrying the victim. Possibly carrying the victim's corpse. He has one last special ability, which I would argue is fairly weak. You can pause and read it if you want. But basically, it gives him a way to escape from long-duration disabling spells, like Hold Monster, etc. He has no real immunities to paralysis, sleep, exhaustion, and stuff like that. But if hit by a spell, or a number of debuffs, which would leave him unable to take actions, or otherwise cripple his ability to attack or defend, he can just turn into nearly indestructible stone. There are technically ways to damage him in this form, but it's hard. However, when he does this, he's out of commission for 3 rounds. Lots of time to run away. When he re-emerges, he doesn't even heal, but he can remove any and all unwanted spells or debuffs from himself. Again, the fact that it takes 3 rounds means it's not as good as it sounds. But it would give me a get-out-of-jail-free card that would prevent him from being cheesed by unforeseen spells or whatever, allowing him to continue the pursuit. Now, importantly, he only has a speed of 20, and he can't take the run action, though he can still charge. So his pursuit through the mountain would really be more relentless than hounding. They could easily gain a lot of ground ahead of him with their superior speed, but they would inevitably lose time trying to navigate rough spots in the dungeon, and every time he catches up, his variety of knockback/knockdown moves, such as the 2 actual maneuvers he has with their crazy strength-based DCs, make it more likely that they would get entangled in hand-to-hand with him for a round or 2 before they could get away again. His equipment is also pretty strong. His breastplate is a +4 breastplate, which gives a 4-point enhancement, like damage reduction, which would be amazing, pretty much. And acid resist 4, why not? And you take -1 damage from any force spell, including -1 damage per hit from magic missiles. The stone breastplate, being literally made of granite, has double the normal armor check penalties and weighs 400 pounds. So you've got to be really strong, or else the weight would just put you past your limit, and that's terrible. It does give the wearer the track feat effectively, but only while touching bare stone, only revealing paths across bare stone or in tunnels. Of course, in some situations this is better than track, because it's normally pretty hard to track people across bare stone, whereas that's exactly what this is for. And then the shield, which I call the slab, is just a granite large shield +2. It gives the wielder a 5/enhancement damage reduction, which, again, the reason I list it as enhancement damage reduction is basically it would stack with one source of, like, pure DR. Like, if your barbarian class level is high enough that you have DR 2/, this enhancement to DR would stack with that, but they won't stack with each other. Unless, of course, you're actually Bolvan. It's his custom gear, so they do stack for him, which is why his DR gets so high. Also, the 4 DR from his armor is why his natural damage reduction is stated as 19 instead of 15, which would be a normal, still huge, but a normally rounded to the 5 sort of number. Of course, the shield is also 250 pounds. Using both of them would be dubious for most beings who don't have 46 strength. In the hallway with the green flame torches, there was actually supposed to be a series of crossbow traps, but I forgot them. Not in a video. As far as I can tell, I forgot them at the table for real. Now, part of the reason I forgot was that these were old-ass traps, the kind that would shred a party of newbies, but were no actual threat to our party. Angel could have literally danced through there, not to mention disarming them would be trivial. My notes said, just by looking at the hall, she could see that it was trapped. But that's part of the reason for including them. never pass up an opportunity to make your players feel good about their awesome characters, if it wouldn't hurt the flow. Plus, it would enforce the idea that there would be further traps. And I think it's good practice to telegraph when traps may be on the table. It may slow things down a bit as the party gets paranoid, but it's also not fair to let them think they're in a plain old trap-free environment and then suddenly spring a nasty one on them. This dungeon, while I did get to have fun designing it as a proper fantasy dungeon, has some constraints. The Rajas told the party that Swain only had 2 beings guarding it, the one at the entrance and the one at the core of the complex, protecting the spirit shackle and presumably prisoner Zahir. That doesn't mean there can't be anything else in there, especially since the info is like a month old. But to me, it's much better if there aren't any other living or undead creatures in the labyrinth which serve the Vampire King. So I can get away with a few other unaffiliated creatures, monsters or monstrous beasts hanging out there, but they have to be unaffiliated with Swain, probably be off the beaten path, and have some reason to be there, and a reason that Swain hasn't had them cleared out. You're not going to find some, random Umberhulk wandering the main path. That's both pointless and annoying. All this means that the main conflict in a dungeon has to be the 2 guardians, and between them, traps or other challenges. And as we found out in this video, one of those challenges is somewhat unusual. The vision which afflicted the party was disturbing because of how real it felt, and because if it represented someone's real memories, as the party suspected, that individual had a pretty traumatizing childhood. The saving throw was extremely difficult, and the consequences not made clear until the start of the next episode. But some people, including the party, wondered why it was so incredibly difficult. Well, since it doesn't change anything, I'll tell you what I only told them out of character at the end of this whole thing. The save was made tremendously more difficult by the presence of the green flame torch. When they encountered the first door, find the path, which I was almost certain they would use, allowing me to build the dungeon to be much less intuitive than one I would build for a party without that spell. It warned them that to open the door required one of the green torches from back in the hallway. Obviously, this would have been unpleasant if they were being chased by Bolvan, but since they weren't, it was a trivial annoyance. Angel zips back, grabs the torch, they open the door, and they're free to continue. They quite reasonably keep the torch, in case it is required by any future doors or mechanisms. But it actually isn't. They could have opened the door and then dropped it, no problem at all. But the torches have a very non-obvious effect hidden in their otherwise simple magic. Anyone within 20 feet of one has -10 to their will saves against mind-affecting magic. So, for this party, with their extremely good saving throws, that's what happens when you have an artificer to make sure you fill all your magic item slots, the save would have been pretty easy. But with the torch, it became very challenging indeed. And of course, knowing this feels really sneaky and mischievous for the DM. I didn't make it super hard. You're the one who brought that bad flashlight with you. This is also why, both in-game and in the videos, I was careful to always note the green flame torch whenever there was any discussion of light sources to give them the theoretical option to wonder if something was up, and perhaps examine it more closely, even though almost nobody would be likely to pick up on that tiny clue during play. There were some other issues, as usual, with forgetting NPCs. Angel rolls for Mora, making it far less likely that she'd be forgotten, but I'm handling Dwarf Daggerface, and I'm pretty bad for forgetting. Frankly, though, with the -10 from the Green Flame Torch, he had very little chance of making that save anyway, and the consequences, if any, would surely just pile up on him. Creating the visions from a technical standpoint was a different issue. In one sense, first-person view sounds easier, because that's one less character I have to draw, presumably an important character who would otherwise require more time to draw. But the disadvantage is that first-person view means I'm locked into a single perspective. Given my relative lack of art skills, that hurts, because it really limits my options for shortcuts to cheat on animation. Now, be real, I've improved a lot with experience, but I'm still a weak animator using the wrong tools. I legit have some of the right tools, but haven't spent the time to relearn how to use them as intended for animation, like the skeleton features in Animate CC, etc. And I'm a pretty poor artist. don't ask me to draw a character from 2 different angles, or any specific angle, or, God forbid, rotating. When stuff looks good, and don't get me wrong, I'm proud of the episodes and legends I put out. I'm proud of most of what I've made, most of what you see on screen, and it gets better and better over time. But when stuff looks good, it's largely due to an accumulation of tricks I've learned to stylize images and cut corners on animation, to create effects without doing the work. Even in my best, most animated stuff, good luck finding a walk cycle or run cycle. So, being locked into the first-person point of view means to convey action, like suddenly swinging around and whacking Ralph with the shovel. I can cheat all the foreground elements, but suddenly there's a real background that I have to animate somehow to convey the idea that you are spinning around. And no matter how lazy my trees and sky, no matter how blurry the perspective, I have to do some kind of work to create the impression that you are turning, including moving all those static mid-ground elements, the ditch, the digging children, the huts, in such a way that, if nothing else, it isn't super distracting. Because if they just slide right off the screen without any kind of stretch or skew for the rotation, your brain will pick up on it. That even in this context, this cartoony, low-res, super blurry context, your brain will still tend to be attracted to that element if it looks too radically wrong. But the blurring, which was initially just part of the blinking into view animation, actually helped give everything in the Visions a distinct vibe, and of course reduced the impact of my laziness in reusing the same villager sprites. And that was good, because even with reusing some old trees, this new environment still required a whole bunch of new art all at once, which I wouldn't want to spend a lot of time on since it probably won't get much reuse later on. Overall, the Vision went pretty well. Spoilers, it's not the last Vision, and each one required a whole bunch of new assets. The next episode had a brief segment that would have been so hard to do in first person that I went full cheat and just showed a third person, but that's a story for another Extras. I'm putting this out early for you, my generous Patreon patrons, so you get a chance to ask questions which I might answer in the final video that goes up free on YouTube. There were a number of questions last time which had to be saved for this episode, and since I'm still an episode behind on Extras, I suspect that may happen again. Marco G asked, if Rainbow Dash were with them, would she be having the Vision too? She just got a magic helm to increase her intellect, so she's technically sapient now, right? So with a 5 or 6 int minimum, she would be in the body of this human, beating someone with a shovel. How trippy would that have been? How much worse if she had somehow made her will save? RBD is definitely now intelligent enough to be affected, and would be very freaked out, but ultimately, I think she would be unable to make sense of the visions and would probably just let them go. Unless she associated something as their source, in which case she would probably become afraid of that. But she'd still get the doom charges and almost certainly fail the will saves. He also asked, you had your PCs tied up quite a while with magical darkness. Was there a way to get around it without triggering the trap? In general, do you leave ways for PCs to get through everything you have, or are some things simply set in stone? I usually try not to railroad them in such situations, even when I'm trying so hard to make things work out in the most epic manner. So much of the Ginneron and Polaron stuff felt like it was barely held together, like it was miraculous that I was able to keep Epsilon alive without cheating. I mean, beyond the ridiculous survival powers Dark Agents already have. But in this case, there was not a lot they could have done to avoid the visions. Though there was the trick that would have made those super difficult saving throws a lot easier. Given they're not being pursued by Balvan, this is ultimately not a major threat. If things had gone different in the entrance, well, we would have found out how much time elapsed during the visions. But mainly, skipping this would have been skipping story, which isn't quite the same as, avoiding a trap. And finally, still Marco G, given how much room there is for DM Fiat when it comes to custom magic, how much freedom were the players given to create and work on new tricks or spells? Well, we've seen Draven create devices that detect certain things. Did Little One ever try to create a maneuver or stance, something custom, lightning-style thing similar to the deep current methods of the Monitor? While I'm not against players researching custom spells, it could be a cool thing. it doesn't fit so well in this campaign. Draven's artificing already gives them immense flexibility in min-maxing all their equipment, and though he has limited castings and has to do a lot of it out of combat, Draven also has access to essentially all spell lists. Basically, more spells would be redundant, and if they need a really custom effect, Draven would create an item for that. As for Little One's maneuvers, although I'm of the opinion that Tome of Battle is mostly fairly balanced against full spellcasters, it would not take much to push it over the edge. You have to remember that increased options really does mean increased power, even if the individual options themselves are balanced against the existing ones. We also haven't played too much with Tome of Battle prior to this campaign, so we aren't exactly tired of what it has to offer yet. If Little One wanted to customize a discipline similar to what the monitors have done, basically changing its theme wholesale, we could definitely work that out. The key, to me, is that if you're swapping out an element, you have to make that change for every maneuver in the discipline, so you aren't gaining some kind of unfair flexibility in terms of your damage types. Like a wizard finding new spells, if a monitor used any custom maneuver in battle against Little one that's not in the book, then he would have the option to learn it next time he leveled up. I was planning to do that, actually, but the custom maneuver I made up was too clunky rules-wise, trying to make it work the way I wanted, so I had to take it back to the drawing board. And obviously that doesn't apply to various freak powers that some monitors have, such as most things they might learn from their monastery's Deathfin scrolls. Xylem asked, Kuo-toa control the oceans, but what about the rivers and the lakes? Shouldn't there be a trickle of aquatic slaves trying to escape into the continent's water system from marooned communities there? Or even some good Kuo-toa? When attacking, the KT use rivers and lakes to their advantage. In fact, they used the large lake in the middle of Ferrandi as a major base of operations, to the point that it figured prominently in the peace treaty. They kept control of the lake, though they're supposedly going to reduce their military presence there, which would be great, but it's very hard for surface dwellers to verify. Further, some of the aquatic slave races, merfolk, aquatic elves, etc., are perfectly happy in freshwater, but the two most numerous, the Diluvian Scum and the Iluj Sahagwin, both don't fare well in freshwater. Surely some slaves try to escape uprivers, etc., but the iron grip of slavery in an old slave society, it's seldom the physical terrain that keeps you trapped. There are huge deserts undersea, vast empty areas into which you could run, but when you were born a slave, grew up a slave, live as a slave, sometimes you can't just run away. Or just don't believe you can. Goblin Gravy asked, I'm interested in the party dynamic. It seems like Little One followed by Draven instigate the most, while Black and especially Angel don't take the lead as much. I'm curious to know more about how the party, in and out of character, works together in various situations. What does each player and character engage the most with? Is it hard for you as a DM to fit in something for everyone? It can be a little hard to keep everyone engaged. Angel is pretty aggressive about scouting and likes using her skills and spells to try and prevent issues. Some of that gets cut for time and for not being great for the flow of the video. She often casts invisibility or some other buff that ends up coming to nothing, because her bias is more towards spending spells over the risk of being caught unprepared. Black's problem is more one that I suffered a lot with my early D&D characters, in that the character's personality is quiet, which is cool and all, often makes cool characters in fiction, but it turns out to be less active and often less fun to RP. So, hint, if you want to play a strong, silent type of PC, try to build in some other outlet for role-playing, like some not too rare circumstance or subject where they become more animated, boisterous, effusive, or rage out loud, or have some kind of secondary character like a familiar through which you can RP. Even a mute familiar can give you a lot of avenue to roleplay just by describing their actions and the attitude with which they perform those actions. Mini storytelling. Anyway, Black's player, Briarstone of YouTube/Twitch semi-fame, Dungeon Master of Sunday Morning Heroes, makes a much more extroverted character for the second campaign, so he'll seem a lot more active whenever we get around to that. Yeah, see you on the final video on YouTube, and don't forget to check out the new Discord now. You can hook it up to your Patreon account and get like one of the special patron roles, which don't make necessarily that much difference, but you do look cooler because you support Tales from My D&D campaign.